Hello everyone, I'm Phương from the University of Languages and International Studies. Today's lesson introduced to you self-assessment. Now, let us find out together what self-assessment is like, and hopefully you will enjoy the lesson. Well, in this lecture, I will step by step address the following issues. The first is a definition, and next come benefits of self-assessment. I also provide you some tools and the way to carry out this activity. And finally, I will give you an example of implementing self-assessment in your classroom. Now, it's a good idea for us to understand what is self-assessment. According to Andre and Drew 2007, self-assessment is the process of formative assessment during which students reflect on and evaluate the quality of their work and their learning, judge the degree to which they reflect explicitly stated goals and criteria, identify strengths and weaknesses in their work, and revise accordingly. So why should we use self-assessment? Well, because it has a wide range of benefits. Firstly, self-assessment encourages reflection on student own learning. And the best part about self-assessment is it promotes learner responsibility and independence. It also deepens student understanding of what constitute quality outcomes. They will know what good work looks like. Last but not least, self-assessment promotes the development of student judgment skills, a necessary skill for lifelong learning. We now move on to some tools for you to conduct this activity. You know, self-assessment can be carried out using checklists and rubrics, KWL charts, reflection entries, learning logs and journals, conversations, conferences, and interviews. Please find the detailed description for these tools from the reading materials. We now move on to the steps to conduct self-assessment. First, what's a next check and notes down the aspects to create the classroom condition and the steps to implement self-assessment.
And receive higher test scores. How can you create the right conditions for students to become their own most important resource in the assessment of their own work? This video will provide you with perspectives from students and teachers regarding the optimum classroom conditions for self-assessment, and will touch upon establishment of clear criteria with a rubric or checklist, supporting thoughtful self-assessment according to those criteria, setting aside time for students to revise and improve upon their work.
When I look at my work, I feel pretty good because I know that I can fix it and I know that I keep trying.
I can do everything myself, and that I can see what I do wrong and how I can make myself better.
It was really helpful because sometimes you don't get your ideas straight and forget to include something. But when you look at the rubric, you know what you have to include.
We sort of have this philosophy in my class that if you are not at the level you wish to be, then you're not done yet. We start projects now in a very different way. We start them by really presenting and clarifying the criteria, the things that count. So my students now know exactly what their goals are and what they need to be immersed in. The self-assessments help them focus back into that criteria.
So, how do you do self-assessment? Consider a colored pencil technique. First, create a rubric with your students. Then, focus your students on specific elements of the criteria on the rubric by having them use a colored pencil to underline key words of a particular criterion on the rubric, and then look for evidence of having met that standard and underline it in the same color. In this example, for the first criterion, thesis, students underlined clear thesis in red, and then underlined their own thesis statement in red and considered whether or not it was clear. If not, they made a note to themselves in the margins that guided revision. You may guide your class through this process for each criterion. Once the essays have been thoroughly assessed, provide your students time to revise their work.
So, how many steps are there? Well, based on what you have watched, we will go through the following steps. Step number 1. Prepare students to engage in self-assessment. In this step, teachers create a class culture where reflection and growth is valued. Define self-assessment in student-friendly language, and more importantly, ensure the learning target and success criteria are co-created and discussed so that students have clear understanding of the expectations for performance that they will use to assess their work. Step number 2. Teachers provide rubrics, checklists, etc. and clearly define tasks to guide self-assessment. Step number 3. Involves modeling and explicitly teaching the process. Teachers model self-assessment by demonstrating the internal thinking involved in self-assessment using work sample. Then, model and teach the process and skill of self-assessment. Step number 4. Students will then practice, engage in self-assessment. Make sure that students practice one step at a time, and teacher provides feedback so students are aware of what went well and what may need to be improved. Step number 5. Give students time to revise this work and set goals for future learning based on their self-assessment and the teacher feedback. And now, we come to an example. As you can see in the picture, the example is designed for unit number 1, taken from the textbook for grade 6, and the topic is My New School. So, how do we use the checklist? This checklist describes the expectations of performance for this unit. Well, you can see the expectations of speaking, listening, reading, writing, and cultural abilities. S stands for student, T for teacher, and P for parent. This can be used at the end of the unit. Students use the checklist to check their progress and reflect on what have been learned and skill they have developed. Once students finish self-assessment, they will demonstrate this ability to the teacher. The teacher then gives feedback on students' progress. Students use the reflection and teacher's feedback to make a decision on what they need to work more on. Well, I have introduced to you the definition, benefits, tools, and ways to implement self-assessment in your own classroom. In the next part of the lesson, we will talk about peer assessment. Stay tuned and we'll see you around. Thank you for watching and bye for now.